Welcome, guys. The biggest card in F1 silly season has been played. Max Verstappen has just made the biggest decision of his F1 career. He's staying at Red Bull, not for another season, not until the end of 2028 when his current contract expires. Max Verstappen has signed a new contract to keep him at Red Bull until the end of 2030. And since this announcement's been made, Max has revealed something that's made this story even more interesting. Let's get to it. Welcome, guys. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. And if you enjoy the video, hit the like. Well, Max signs for Red Bull, and that is a massive story. Four-time world champion. I think he was clogging up the driver market. Everybody's just holding their breath, waiting for him to make his move. And well, the biggest threat to Red Bull wasn't actually Mercedes to keep Max Verstappen. It wasn't McLaren. It was actually Max Verstappen walking away from F1 altogether. He said he was actually closer to retiring F1 than he was joining another team. And yet he's committed himself to potentially another 4 seasons with Red Bull. I say potentially because we'll get into the contract nitty-gritty as well. And well, that's despite Red Bull currently sitting 4th in the championship. Max Verstappen 6th in the drivers. He's been winless so far in 26. And well, despite the fact that he had potentially the opportunity to leave plenty of options up and down the grid, the obvious question really is why? And why has he chosen this moment to commit his prime years to Red Bull, a team that's currently isn't capable of fighting for a world championship? What has Red Bull shown him? What does this tell us about Lauren McKees and Red Bull's future? And has Max Verstappen made just one of the smartest decisions of his career or his biggest gamble? We'll get into it because the contract, that's where we'll start. What's happened? Red Bull have officially confirmed that Max will remain with the team until 2030. His previous contract ran until the end of 2028. He had effectively had another 2 seasons already to what was, one of the most successful driver-team relationships F1's ever seen. And here's some perspective on that. Max joined Red Bull senior team in 2016. And we all remember what happened next after that. His first race to Spanish Grand Prix, first victory. And since then, Max has won 4 world championships and 71 Grand Prix. And if he completes his new contract, he'll have spent roughly 15 seasons driving for the Red Bull senior team. And that's an incredible record. Potentially, if he remains through 2027, he could pass Lewis Hamilton's record of 246 Grand Prix starts with a single constructor. And when we talk about Max Verstappen and Red Bull now, we're moving beyond a successful partnership. It's becoming one of those relationships where it's difficult to imagine one without the other. Schumacher with Ferrari and Lewis had that with Mercedes until his surprising switch. And increasingly, it's Verstappen and Red Bull now. And there's one enormous difference. When Hamilton signed his major Mercedes contract, Mercedes were winning. When Schumacher committed to Ferrari, the entire project was being built towards becoming dominant. Max Verstappen is signing this contract when Red Bull is struggling, and that's what makes this fascinating. Why now? Because if you look at the results, this is a strange time to extend your contract. He's, like I said, they're 6th in the Drivers' Championship. He's 110 points behind Kimi Antonelli. Red Bull 4th in the Constructors. He hasn't won a Grand Prix yet. He's only managed 4 podiums so far. And this comes as where there's enormous changes inside the Red Bull team as well. Christian Horner gone, Helmut Marko gone, Adrian Newey's left. GP, Max Verstappen's long-time race engineers moving to McLaren at the end of 2028. And you think about how different Red Bull looks now compared with the team that helped Max dominate F1. And yet Verstappen hasn't looked at that and thought, maybe it's a time for me to leave as well. He's done the opposite. He's extended, which tells us something pretty important here. Max isn't signing this contract because of the Red Bull he's driving today. It's because he believes that the Red Bull that they're building for tomorrow. And that's where Laura McKees becomes increasingly important, an incredibly important part of the jigsaw. I think he's one of the most interesting parts of Verstappen's comments was his praise of Mekis. Max talked about the direction of the team and the vision Mekis has for Red Bull. And that I don't think that should be underestimated here. McKees has inherited probably one of the most difficult situations in F1. Red Bull's period of dominance was disappearing, senior figures leaving left, right, and centre, regulations changing. And Red Bull were preparing to build and race their own F1 power unit for the first time through the Red Bull powertrains with Ford. And the biggest asset, Max Verstappen, was potentially, he had a way out. If Max had left during that period, Red Bull could have entered a genuine crisis. I mean, if we're not already there yet, but this is a massive coup. And instead, Mekis has convinced him to stay until 2030. And I think that's massive for him and the team. Verstappen said following the announcement that they've had the right people, and ultimately the target is getting Red Bull back to the top. And that's probably one of the biggest endorsements McKees could probably receive, because Max could have waited. He could have explored Mercedes. He could have explored McLaren. Instead, he's effectively saying, I believe in this project and it can win again. So what's convinced him? What has Max seen that we haven't? And this is where I think this story gets really interesting, because Max has access to information we clearly don't. He sees Red Bull's development program. He speaks to the engineers. He knows what upgrades are coming. And he understands where Red Bull believe the RB22 has gone and where it's gone wrong. He knows what progress Red Bull's powertrains is making, and he'll have a far better understanding of the Red Bull long-term technical direction than any of us watching from the outside. Remember, 26 wasn't simply a new car regulation for Red Bull. It's probably one of the biggest technical challenges in the team's history. Red Bull becoming a power unit manufacturer. They've developed the Red Bull Ford power unit, which, while simultaneously adapting to completely new chassis and aerodynamic regs, I think there was always an enormous gamble, and that they've clearly struggled with in parts this season. And there's an interesting technical detail here. Red Bull could potentially have benefited from FIA's the Duo system, that system which allows the manufacturers who are sufficiently behind the leading power units to receive additional development opportunities. Mekis has previously indicated Red Bull's powertrains could qualify for that. So ironically, being behind at the beginning of this regulation cycle could give Red Bull opportunities to close that gap. There's rumours that might be opening again. FI potentially said they could have got that wrong with the initial announcement to say, that the Red Bull powertrains was the best. Maybe Max has seen enough development progress to believe that it can happen, that, maybe he's seen Red Bull's next major upgrade. He's seen the power unit development data. He's seen the recruitment plan. And we simply don't know. What we do know is that a four-time world champion with options has decided that Red Bull's remains the place that he wants to be, and that's significant. Could he have left? Well, this is another part the story that I think is being overlooked. Max wasn't necessarily trapped at Red Bull. His previous contract contained performance-related clauses. With Red Bull struggling, Max Verstappen outside the leading championship positions, those clauses could... they created genuine speculation that Max could walk away. We've heard it, and it's been, reports weeks earlier to this, that Verstappen potentially had until October to make this decision. There were even reports that Red Bull wanted to restructure or remove those exit mechanisms, but instead of triggering the escape route, Max has signed another contract. And however, and this is important, Reuters reports have said that performance-related core clause remains in the new agreement. We don't know the precise conditions for that. So when we say Max is locked in until 2030, there needs to probably be a little asterisk around the outside of that still. Contracted until 2030, absolutely. Guaranteed to remain regardless of Red Bull's performance? Not necessarily so. I actually think that makes disagreement more logical from Verstappen's perspective. He's given Red Bull time. He's backing McKees. He's backing the Red Bull Ford project, and potentially he's protecting himself. If Red Bull recover, fantastic. If they don't, Max Verstappen will still have options. And one of those options could have been McLaren, because this story has probably another fascinating element to it as well. Max Verstappen's management were reportedly involved in exploratory discussions, as it was called, with McLaren earlier this year. And just imagine that for a second, Max Verstappen driving a McLaren. And there was another connection that made this rumor even more interesting, was the GP scenario. His engineer for an incredible successful period with him. And the radio conversations that effectively have become part of F1, Lambiase heading to McLaren from 2028. So natural people connected two and two together. GP moves to McLaren. And could Max follow? But this new contract has poured a huge bucket of cold water over that theory. McLaren already have Lando and Oscar. Verstappen is now committed himself to Red Bull, at least for the foreseeable future anyway. And then there was also that Mercedes outfit. Toto Wolff is no secret admirer of Max Verstappen, is he? He's always lurching around. And the timing would have made sense. Going to Mercedes, and they've adapted extremely well to the 2026 regulations. Kimi Antonelli leads the championship at the moment. Verstappen are fighting at the front. Mercedes are fighting at the front. And Verstappen's just watching the battle from sixth place. So if Max's only priority was put me in the fastest car possible, then surely Mercedes would have been a serious consideration for him. But there's another problem there. Why would Mercedes blow something up that's already working? Antonelli's leading the championship. George Russell remains a strong driver, and Mercedes have their own long-term project. So perhaps with the Mercedes Verstappen window closing, potentially, I think this contract might have finally ended a transfer story we've been talking about for years. George Russell has said post this, actually, that he didn't fear Max taking his seat. So really interesting. George knew something apparently we didn't. But I think Toto and then Verstappen really become an option for him. Toto would have snapped him up. There's no doubt about that. And I think this is where we get to the new deal, and this is completely changes how I look at this story, because Max has revealed that he was closer to retiring than changing teams, and I think that's absolutely massive. We've spent months asking Mercedes or Red Bull, McLaren or Red Bull, but perhaps what wasn't the real discussion maybe was Red Bull or no F1 at all. And suddenly his contracts makes much more sense. Max has never hidden the fact that F1 isn't necessarily something he wants to do forever. He's spoken about racing other categories. He's done that this year. He's involved heavily in sim racing. He's built his own racing project, and he's particularly unhappy with elements of F1 and the new regulations. So if he didn't enjoy this generation of F1, why would he leave the environment he knows and loves to start somewhere else? And maybe Red Bull wasn't competing against Mercedes for Max. Maybe Red Bull was competing against Max's desire to just walk away. And Red Bull have won that battle. They've won him over. I think there's another development that I find really interesting as well, is the possibility that eventually F1 is moving back to the V8 engines, and that appears to have influenced Max's thinking about his future. Max has been openly critical about the current power unit regs, and the possibility of F1 going back to lighter, simpler, and potentially the V8 engines as well, lighter, simpler cars. And I think that's given him something to look forward to here. And Max has now suggested that he isn't necessarily planning on stopping in 2030. Previously, you could look at his contract and think, that's it, 2030. Max is 33. He leaves F1, but now he's leaving that door open if the racing is good. He enjoys the cars. If he enjoys the cars, if F1 moves in the direction that he likes. And that's something that's been really strong in his statement and his comments post signing this contract. That he could race beyond 2030. And considering how often he's talked about retiring relatively early, I think that's quite a significant shift in Max Verstappen's psyche and the way he's talking. Red Bull is his second family. There's also something much simpler behind this decision, and that is how comfortable he is at Red Bull. He's described him as the second family, and sometimes we underestimate how important that is. Max doesn't need another massive contract to prove anything. He's already four-time world champion, and he's already one of the most successful Formula One drivers ever, 71 race wins. And perhaps his priorities are different now. At Red Bull, the team is built around him. He understands the engineers. He knows how the organization operates. And they understand his personality. They give him the freedom outside of F1, and I think that's absolutely crucial. They've been together, Max, since he was a teenager. Red Bull have backed him before anyone knew exactly what he would become. And so maybe Max isn't interested in becoming a Mercedes driver, or he doesn't really care about becoming a McLaren driver. Maybe Max sees his Formula One career as Red Bull or nothing. And his latest comments certainly suggest that possibility. Has Max made just a huge gamble? But loyalty doesn't win world championships. Fast cars do. And I think that's why we still have to ask the uncomfortable question here. Has Max just gambled away his prime years of his career? He's 28 years old. He's the next 4 or 5 seasons should theoretically be the best of his career, but right now Red Bull aren't giving him the car. Mercedes are ahead, McLaren ahead, Ferrari are ahead as well as it stands at the moment. He hasn't won a Grand Prix this season, and so the two completely different ways this story could end. Scenario number one, Red Bull fixed the power unit. They understand the new regs. McKees rebuilds the organisation and they produce another championship winning car. Max leads them back to the top, and if that happens, this contract looks absolutely genius. And actually, I'd argue it enhances Verstappen's legacy. Winning world championships while at Red Bull were dominating was impressive. To stay there through a difficult period and drag them back to the top, I think that's an even better story. Scenario number two, Red Bull don't recover, Mercedes remain dominant, for McLaren keep improving, and Ferrari eventually nail these regulations, and Max could spend 3 or 4 years fighting for podiums instead of world championships. And he's probably looking back at this announcement asking, why didn't he leave when he had the chance? And that's what makes this contract so fascinating at this time in the whole Red Bull scenario, if we look at it as an overview. For Red Bull, I think this is absolutely enormous. Forget another upgrade, forget any other technical signing. Keeping Max Verstappen is probably one of the most important pieces of Red Bull's rebuild, because imagine trying to convince elite engineers to join the team after your 4-time world champion has just left. Flip that around, you now have got engineers considering joining Red Bull. Max Verstappen's committed, and the message is clear. If Max believes this project can work, well, come join us, help us. And that helps recruitment, helps sponsors, helps morale. It helps McKees with his stability. And most importantly, Red Bull know that if they can build a competitive car, they already have a driver capable of winning a championship with it. What does this do to the driver market? That's another massive consequence. The 2027 driver market, it's not as exciting as it was before this announcement, that's for sure. Max Verstappen was probably the biggest domino. Mercedes, no. McLaren, no. Red Bull, Max stays. Williams have already committed Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz, and was this, Carlos and Alex getting wind of Max Verstappen signing, quite possibly and quite probably, and the intentions now move elsewhere. The attention just, it's who gets the second Red Bull seat long term. What happens with Fernando Alonso? What happens at Aston Martin? And what happens further down the grid? But the biggest prize available isn't available anymore. At least not unless there's one of those performance clauses that becomes relevant again. And that is something worth remembering. So after everything we've probably learnt today, I actually think this contract tells us more about Max Verstappen than it does Red Bull. Max had three options. He could leave Red Bull, he could retire, or he could stay and try and build Red Bull. He's chosen option 3. He's back in McKees. He's back in the Red Bull powertrains. He's backed Ford and he's backed the engineers back at Milton Keynes. And ultimately, he's backed himself. And crucially, with that performance clause reportedly still in the contract, he's probably also protected himself if the rebuild goes west. And maybe that's the smartest part of the entire deal, because Max gets what he wants. He stays with his second family. He gets what he desperately needs and what they desperately need, and that's stability. And F1 gets the possibility of Max Verstappen remaining in the sport, not just until 2030, but potentially beyond that. So I want to know what you guys think. If you were Max Verstappen, would you have signed this contract, or would you have looked at Mercedes or McLaren and taken the opportunity to start again? Here's another bigger question. Max currently has 4 world championships. How many does he have when this contract ends? 5, 6, 7 or more? Put your number in the comments, because if you think the answer to the question ultimately decides whether this contract is a masterstroke or the biggest mistake of his career. If you enjoy the video, hit the like, subscribe for more F1 news and analysis, and I'll see you on the next one.